The first sound anyone remembered was the crying. Not the cry of a normal child, but something thinner, wetter, as if the lungs inside the small body had never properly learned the shape of air. It echoed across the black water of the Bayou, sometime before dawn. Sometime in the middle of a humid Louisiana summer, when the insects screamed louder than the wind. Old fishermen who worked the marsh channels would later say the sound carried strangely over the water that morning. Not like a newborn, more like an animal caught between breathing and drowning. By the time the crying stopped, the swamp had already swallowed the noise, and the Budro family had already begun another generation. The property where the child was born sat far beyond the last gravel road of Terrebonne Parish, hidden behind walls of cypress and stagnant water that most locals refused to cross. The land had once belonged to a Cajun fisherman named Jean Baptiste Budro sometime, around the middle of the 19th century. A simple man, a quiet man. The kind of man who arrived in a place where nobody else wished to live and decided that was exactly where he would remain. His cabin was built on uneven stilts along a narrow bayou channel, surrounded by moss, draped trees, and mud that swallowed boots whole. In those early years, the Budro name appeared occasionally in parish records, fishing licenses, property ledgers, baptism notes written by traveling priests. Then the records began to thin. Then the visits stopped. Then the Budro family slowly vanished from the visible world. But the bloodline did not end. It folded inward. It tightened around itself like a knot. And long before the authorities would ever step onto that land in 1978, something had already been growing there for decades. Something shaped by isolation. Something shaped by blood that refused to leave itself. Before the story continues, there is something quietly worth asking. Which city are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Somewhere in the world, it may already be late. The hour when old stories feel closer. The hour when forgotten places begin to breathe again. Because the swamps of southern Louisiana have always had a way of keeping secrets. The Pantanosa marshlands stretch for miles across Terrebonne Parish, a labyrinth of water channels, sinking earth, and trees older than most American towns, even in modern maps. Some sections remain barely documented, patches of green and blue where the land refuses to be fully measured. In the late 1800s, families who settled there learned quickly that distance from civilization created its own kind of law. People lived quietly. People minded their own blood. And the Budro family became one of those names that drifted through the region like a rumor, rather than a household. They traded fish in town once or twice a year. They bought sacks of salt, flour, and kerosene. Then they returned to the swamp, always together, always alone. By the time the Great Depression scarred the country in the 1930s, a man named Maurice Budro had inherited what remained of the family land. Maurice was the great-grandson of Jean Baptiste, and according to the few notes that survive from parish records, Maurice carried with him an idea that would slowly poison every generation that followed. The belief that the outside world was rotting, and that only the Budro bloodline was worth preserving. When he did appear, once or twice each year, along the docks of Terrebonne, he carried the same quiet expression that fishermen remembered from his father and grandfather before him. He traded barrels of catfish and turtle meat for sacks of flour, salt blocks, lamp oil, and occasionally medical supplies. Then he disappeared again into the swamp. But something had changed in Maurice that the older men along the docks noticed long before anyone understood what it meant. He no longer brought his children into town. In earlier years, Budro boys had followed their fathers to the market, standing quietly beside the wagons while adults spoke. But after 1935, Maurice arrived alone. When traders asked about his growing family, he simply said the children were safer where they were. Away from corruption, away from sickness, away from the outside world. The first hints of his thinking appeared in a series of notebooks, later recovered from the property decades afterward. Maurice kept careful records of births, marriages, and physical descriptions of every child born into the Budro line. The handwriting was precise, almost obsessive. Each page listed names, dates, and short observations written beside them, like the notes of a farmer cataloging livestock. Strong bones, eyes slightly uneven, good blood from both sides. But there was one phrase that appeared more often than any other: pure. Maurice believed the Budro family carried something special in its blood, something older than the towns that surrounded them, something he believed would disappear if the family mixed with outsiders. At first, his ideas did not seem particularly unusual in that isolated region. Rural communities throughout Louisiana often relied heavily on extended family networks. Cousin marriages occurred occasionally, especially in small settlements where options were limited. But Maurice began to encourage something far more deliberate. He began arranging unions within the family. His eldest son Joseph married a first cousin named Marie in 1953. Parish officials never registered the marriage, but Maurice recorded it carefully in his notebooks. 6 children followed. The first 2 appeared healthy enough, though neighbors who briefly saw them years later would remember subtle differences. Extra fingers, slight facial asymmetry, small irregularities that could easily be dismissed in an isolated swamp family. Maurice wrote beside their names with quiet satisfaction: blood preserved. But the pattern did not stop there. By the late 1950s, Maurice had 5 children of his own, 3 sons and 2 daughters, all raised within the closed borders of the swamp property. They attended no schools, they saw no doctors. Their understanding of the world came entirely from the stories Maurice told beside kerosene lamps at night. Stories about outsiders who carried disease. Stories about cities filled with moral decay. Stories about the sacred responsibility of protecting Budro blood. And when those children grew old enough to begin families of their own, Maurice arranged the pairings himself. Cousins were matched first, then closer relations followed. Inside the swamp, the Budro property slowly transformed into a small, sealed colony of bloodlines folding inward. Cabins multiplied along the muddy edges of the Bayou. 5 rough houses eventually stood within the clearing, all built from the same weathered timber, all connected by narrow walkways of warped planks rising above the water. 30 people lived there by the early 1970s. 30 people connected by a family tree that no longer branched outward. It circled, and in that closed circle, the next generation began to arrive. The children born after 1970 were different. Even Maurice's own notes grew more uneasy when describing them. Heads smaller than usual, speech delayed, hands not forming correctly. Yet the births continued. 4 children were born between 1971 and 1976 to Paul and Annette Budro, 2 cousins who shared the same grandparents. By the time the youngest child arrived, even the swamp seemed to react. Neighbors who lived miles away would later remember strange sounds traveling across the marsh at night. Thin cries, uneven footsteps, and sometimes something stranger. Children's voices that did not quite sound like children. The children who grew up inside the Budro clearing did not know there was a world beyond the trees. They believed the swamp was everything: water, mud, insects, moss-covered trunks leaning over black channels that moved slowly through the earth like veins. The sky itself appeared only in narrow fragments, through the hanging curtains of Spanish moss. Maurice made sure the outside world remained distant. There was no electricity on the property, no radio, no telephone. The only light at night came from kerosene lamps and small cooking fires that flickered between the cabins like restless spirits. The older children learned to fish before they learned to speak properly. They learned how to set traps for turtles and muskrats. They learned how to move quietly through knee-deep water without disturbing the surface. And they learned something else that Maurice repeated constantly in the dim glow of lantern light. The family must remain inside itself. Blood must not escape. The younger generation accepted these words the same way. They accepted the shape of the swamp. It was simply the way things were. But by the early 1970s, the results of those beliefs were beginning to show in ways that even the family could not ignore. The third generation of children, born inside the closed Budro bloodline, did not grow like the ones before them. Some struggled to walk. Some could not form clear words, even as they reached the age when speech should have come easily. Several carried physical signs that disturbed even their parents, though none dared speak openly against Maurice's rules. One boy had 6 fingers on each hand, the extra digits twisted and stiff like small roots growing in the wrong direction. Another child's head remained noticeably smaller than the rest of his body, his eyes unfocused, his movements uncertain. The youngest girl born to Paul and Annette was the most unsettling of all. Her name was Emily. When she arrived in the summer heat of 1974, the midwife, Lorraine Budro, who had taken the role of healer within the family, remained silent for a long time after the birth. The baby's face did not form the way a human face should. Where 2 eyes should have opened, there was only one. A single central eye, resting above a smooth ridge of bone where the nose should have grown. The nasal passages never formed. The child struggled to breathe, even in the first hours of life. Maurice studied the infant carefully before writing in his notebook. Rare formation, still Budro blood, and the baby lived, against every expectation. The small body continued breathing through the humid air of the swamp. The family constructed a small cradle beside the warmest corner of the cabin and kept the child close to the fire during cooler nights. Emily survived the first week, then the first month, then the first year. By the time she reached the age of 4, she had never spoken a single word. She could not walk properly. She moved slowly across the wooden floor, using uneven limbs, guided more by sound than sight. But the older children treated her as if she were simply another member of the family. Inside the Budro clearing, deformity had already begun to lose its meaning. Maurice himself had developed a quiet system of classification among the children, assigning simple tasks depending on their physical and cognitive abilities. Those who could work were taught to fish or gather wood. Those who struggled to move were kept close to the cabins. And those who could barely function at all were simply allowed to exist within the strange rhythm of the swamp. Over time, the family stopped noticing how different their world had become. The children no longer compared themselves to anyone outside the clearing. There was no one left to compare. But sometimes, late at night, when the swamp air grew heavy and still, the sounds drifting across the Bayou began to change. Hunters passing miles away would later describe hearing thin cries in the distance. Not quite human, not quite animal. And sometimes, just for a moment, something that sounded almost like children laughing. For many years, the Budro clearing existed almost entirely outside the knowledge of the world. The swamp protected it. Roads never reached that far into the marsh. Boats could pass through the narrow Bayou channels, but only if the person navigating them already knew where to go. The water twisted through the cypress forest, in confusing patterns, doubling back on itself, hiding small pockets of land that even experienced fishermen avoided. The Budro land sat inside one of those pockets, a place where sound traveled strangely across the water, a place where smoke from cooking fires could disappear beneath the low branches before anyone in the distance noticed. By the early 1970s, 32 people lived within that clearing. 5 cabins stood in a loose circle above the mud, each connected by narrow planks nailed together from old lumber. Between them, children moved slowly across the damp ground, their shapes sometimes visible through the hanging moss when the sun rose high enough to break through the trees. Visitors never came, and yet strange routines had formed inside the family. At night, the adults gathered in the largest cabin, where Maurice, now an old man whose hands shook slightly when he wrote, continued reading passages from religious texts he had altered over time. The words were no longer recognizable as traditional scripture. They had changed. Maurice spoke about the sacred duty of protecting the bloodline. He spoke about the corruption of cities. He spoke about how the Budro family had been chosen to remain separate from the sickness of the outside world, and the children listened. Even those who could barely understand language sat quietly on the wooden floor, while the old man's voice moved slowly through the darkness. But there were other signs that something inside the family had begun to slip further from ordinary human behavior. Several of the older children had started drawing strange pictures in the dirt outside the cabins. Circles, lines connecting small stick figures, shapes that resembled crude family trees folding back into themselves again and again. Sometimes animals were found dead near the clearing: raccoons, turtles, small birds pulled from the marsh reeds. Their bodies were arranged carefully beside those drawings. No one admitted to placing them there, but no one removed them either. The swamp slowly reclaimed the remains, and the children continued their quiet routines. As the third generation grew older, another pattern became harder to ignore. Some of the children seemed to possess an unsettling awareness far beyond what their limited education should have allowed. They spoke in broken sentences, yet sometimes repeated fragments of conversations they should not have heard. One boy named Daniel often stood alone near the waterline, staring at the Bayou for hours. When his mother once asked what he was watching, the boy answered with words that unsettled even the adults. "The water remembers the old ones." No one knew where he had heard that phrase. And Maurice, despite his obsession with recording every detail of family life, never wrote anything about those moments. Perhaps even he felt the boundaries of control beginning to weaken. But the truth waiting beneath the Budro bloodline was already deeper than any strange behavior. Because by that time, the family tree had folded so tightly inward that its structure could barely be traced anymore. The parents of many children were cousins. Some were closer. Brothers had taken sisters as wives in ceremonies performed quietly inside the cabins without witnesses beyond the immediate family. Names repeated across generations until it became difficult to distinguish one branch from another. The blood had nowhere left to go except deeper into itself, and the consequences were becoming impossible to hide. The youngest children born after 1970 carried severe deformities that no explanation inside Maurice's doctrine could justify. Some could not survive infancy. Small graves began appearing beyond the edge of the clearing, where the ground rose slightly above the swamp water. Simple wooden markers, no names, just dates scratched into the wood. By the time the decade reached its final years, 23 small graves rested beneath the cypress trees, and still the births continued. Until the spring of 1978, when the swamp allowed a stranger to wander too close. The storm that carried the stranger into the Budro clearing arrived quickly. In the swamps of southern Louisiana, storms do not always announce themselves with distant thunder. Sometimes the sky simply darkens, the air grows heavy, and the wind begins pushing through the cypress branches with a slow rising force that fishermen learned to respect. On the afternoon of March 17, 1978, a local hunter named Thomas LeBlanc had been moving through the marsh searching for trapped nutria when the storm shifted the channels around him. Water levels rose. Familiar landmarks disappeared beneath rain and wind. By dusk, he realized he had lost the narrow trail that would normally guide him back toward the nearest road. The swamp after dark becomes something else entirely. Sound travels farther. Shapes move where nothing should be moving. LeBlanc later described the moment he first saw smoke rising through the trees as both relief and unease. Smoke meant people, but no one he knew lived that deep inside the marsh. He followed the faint column of gray through the thick cypress growth until the trees suddenly opened into a small clearing above the waterline. 5 cabins stood there, built unevenly along a muddy patch of land, surrounded by shallow channels. At first he thought the structures were abandoned. The wood looked old. The roofs sagged under years of humidity and rot. But then he saw movement. Children were standing near one of the cabins. Several of them. LeBlanc stopped behind the cover of a tree, unsure whether he should approach or call out. What he saw in the fading light unsettled him in a way he struggled to describe later. The children moved strangely. Some walked with slow, unsteady steps, as if their legs were unsure of their purpose. Others crawled across the ground, their limbs bending in unnatural directions. One small figure turned its head toward him. The shape of the child's face did not appear right. The head seemed too small, the eyes too widely spaced. Another child passed behind the cabin doorway, and LeBlanc noticed extra fingers curling against the wooden frame. The hunter felt something cold settle inside his chest. He did not step forward. He did not call out. Instead, he watched quietly from the trees for several minutes, while the children wandered across the clearing, unaware they were being observed. Then he saw one more figure, a girl moving slowly along the wooden walkway between cabins. Her head tilted slightly as she crawled forward, and when the fading light struck her face, LeBlanc felt the breath leave his lungs. There was only one eye, just one, centered above a smooth ridge of bone where a nose should have been. The child turned toward the sound of wind moving through the trees, her single eye reflecting the pale, gray sky. LeBlanc stepped backward immediately. Branches snapped beneath his boots as he retreated through the forest, the storm now crashing fully across the swamp behind him. He did not stop moving until he reached the road hours later. And the next morning, still shaken by what he believed he had seen, he drove directly to the Terrebonne Parish Sheriff's Office. At first, the officers assumed the hunter had exaggerated the story. People often told strange tales about things hidden in the marshlands. But something about the details in LeBlanc's description, about the children, the deformities, the isolated cabins, forced the sheriff to listen more carefully. 2 weeks later, in early April, a small group of deputies prepared to enter the swamp. They carried boats, cameras, and medical personnel. No one yet understood what they were about to find. But the Budro family's hidden world was finally about to open. The deputies entered the swamp before sunrise. Two flat, bottom boats moved slowly through the narrow channels, their motors barely above idle, so the sound would not carry too far across the water. The men navigating the boats had lived in Terrebonne Parish their entire lives. Yet even they moved carefully through the maze of cypress trunks and dark water. The directions given by Thomas Leblanc were vague. A bend in the Bayou, a broken tree leaning across the channel, a clearing hidden behind heavy moss. For nearly 2 hours the search team pushed deeper into the marsh, following the slow turns of the water until one of the deputies finally raised a hand and cut the motor. Smoke drifted above the trees, thin, grey, exactly where Leblanc had described. They guided the boats the rest of the way in silence. When the clearing finally appeared between the trees, the men stepped onto the muddy ground with a strange hesitation. What they saw in front of them did not resemble any normal household. 5 cabins stood clustered around a patch of dry land. The wood was blackened from years of smoke and humidity. Narrow walkways connected the structures like fragile bridges over the mud. For a moment nothing moved. Then one of the cabin doors opened. A man stepped outside slowly. He was thin, older than the deputies expected, with deep lines across his face and pale eyes that seemed almost surprised to see strangers standing in the clearing. Behind him, other figures began to appear, women, children. At first the officers believed exhaustion from the long journey into the swamp might be distorting what they were seeing. Then the full scene became clear. The children gathering behind the cabins were not ordinary. Some had heads noticeably smaller than their bodies. Several walked with twisted legs that forced them into awkward, uneven steps. One boy held up a hand where 6 fingers bent stiffly against one another, and near the doorway of the central cabin, a small figure crawled slowly across the wooden boards. The girl lifted her head. Only one eye looked back at them. Sheriff Dale Theriot would later write in his official report that the moment felt unreal. In 22 years of law enforcement, he had encountered violence, poverty, and neglect in many forms. But nothing prepared him for the sight of so many children carrying visible deformities within a single family. The old man who had stepped outside first introduced himself quietly. Jerome Budro. He was the son of Maurice, who had died several years earlier, but whose notebooks were still carefully stored inside the main cabin. Jerome did not appear frightened by the arrival of authorities. If anything, he seemed confused by their concern. When asked how many people lived on the property, he answered calmly, 32, all family. The deputies began documenting what they found. Cabins with no electricity, no plumbing, no medical supplies beyond crude herbal mixtures prepared by Lorraine Budro, the family's self-appointed healer. Inside the cabins were beds made from rough timber, cooking pots blackened by constant fire, and stacks of handwritten notebooks filled with genealogical records stretching back decades. But the most disturbing discovery lay within those pages. The family tree Maurice Budro had maintained revealed that many of the children standing in the clearing were the product of multiple generations of marriages between close relatives. First cousins, then closer, some unions had occurred between siblings. The bloodline had turned inward so many times that the diagram in Maurice's notebooks resembled a tangled knot of names repeating across every generation. A physician named Margaret Wilson began examining the children that same afternoon. Her first medical notes described what she saw with clinical precision: severe cranial deformities, advanced polydactyly, congenital heart conditions, profound intellectual impairment, and among the youngest children born after 1970. Nearly every individual carried some visible sign of genetic collapse. The Budro family had become a living record of what happens when isolation and bloodline obsession are allowed to grow unchecked for generations. But the deputies were only beginning to understand the full weight of what had been hidden inside that clearing. Because just beyond the cabins, partially concealed beneath the cypress trees, another discovery waited beneath the wet Louisiana soil, beyond the cabins, where the swamp water thinned into a narrow strip of dry earth. The deputies noticed a row of wooden markers leaning beneath the cypress trees. At first they believed it was an ordinary family cemetery. Small communities in the marsh often buried their dead close to home. Weathered crosses, hand-carved names, simple graves surrounded by moss and mud. None of that was unusual in rural Louisiana. But as the officers stepped closer, the pattern became harder to ignore. Most of the graves were very small, short wooden crosses, some no longer standing upright, marked the ground in uneven rows. The wood had softened from decades of humidity, and many of the names had already faded away. Some markers carried only a single word, child. Others carried no names at all, just dates. The deputies counted 23 graves before they stopped. Nearly all belonged to infants or very young children. Many of those births had never appeared in any state record. The swamp had received them quietly. Medical teams who later examined the surviving Budro children discovered that the deformities visible on their bodies were only a small part of the damage carried inside them. Congenital heart disease, severe kidney malformations, neurological conditions that prevented normal development. Out of the 17 children born after 1970, only a small number were expected to survive into adulthood, even with modern treatment. When the state removed the youngest members of the family from the swamp later that year, the transition into the outside world became another kind of shock. Many of the children had never seen electricity. Some stared in silence at the glow of hospital lights, as if the brightness itself were painful. Television screens frightened them. The sound of telephones made several of them cover their ears and cry. Their entire understanding of life had been shaped by the narrow clearing inside the swamp. Beyond those trees, nothing felt real. The adults faced a different fate. Several remained under supervision in rural communities nearby, where authorities quietly ensured that the old family patterns would not begin again. Others struggled to adapt to ordinary society. Many carried mild cognitive impairment themselves, the slower echoes of the same genetic damage that had devastated the younger generation. The Budro land eventually fell silent. By 1990, the property had been absorbed into a protected nature reserve. The cabins collapsed slowly under the weight of rain and rot until only fragments of wood remained above the waterline. The small cemetery still exists somewhere among the cypress trees, but the crosses have long since dissolved into the soil. Today the swamp grows over everything that once stood there. Yet the story never fully disappeared. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, geneticists studying rare hereditary diseases began quietly referencing the Budro case in academic research. The preserved family records revealed one of the most extreme examples ever documented of prolonged human consanguinity. Generation after generation of marriages within the same bloodline. A family tree that folded inward until the genetic consequences became unavoidable. Researchers studying those records described the Budro lineage as a tragic demonstration of the founder effect. A small population carrying hidden recessive mutations that become increasingly concentrated when reproduction remains confined within the same group. But statistics and medical language cannot fully describe what happened inside that swamp. Because beyond the science there remains another question, a quieter one that still lingers when the story is told. How could an entire community hear rumors for decades and never look closely enough to see what was happening there? Old residents of Terrebonne Parish would later admit they had heard whispers about the strange family deep in the marsh. Stories passed quietly between fishermen. Stories about children who never came to town. Stories about a man who bought supplies twice a year and never allowed anyone to follow him home. But the swamp has always carried a certain superstition with it, and people often prefer not to disturb the things that live far beyond the edge of the road. The Budro descendants who survived grew older in scattered homes, hospitals, and care facilities across Louisiana. Some still carry the physical consequences of those generations. Others carry only the memories. A woman identified in later interviews only as Alice once said something that stayed with the researchers who spoke to her. We thought that was the whole world. The swamp had been their universe. The cabins, the water, the voices repeating the same lessons about blood and purity. And by the time the outside world finally arrived, the damage had already been written across multiple generations. Stories like this often fade quietly into archives. Old case files, medical reports, boxes of photographs sealed inside government storage rooms. But sometimes they return in small ways. A genealogist uncovering an unfamiliar name. A researcher reading a notebook filled with strange family diagrams. A hunter remembering the moment he saw a child with one eye staring through the trees. And when those fragments come together again, the same unsettling thought always rises. Blood remembers where it came from, and sometimes, if left alone long enough, it begins folding back into itself. So before the story fades into the dark again, there is one final thing worth asking. If you discovered that your own family history carried secrets like this, what would you do if you learned your mother was also your sister?